Hello, hello everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all had a great weekend. Today we're going to be talking about clinical psychology again. Today's our last kind of formal lesson. We're going to go over etiology and treatment. Causes of developing a mental illness. I want you guys to kind of journal and think about that. I think I put some space in your guided notes to do that. So go ahead, think of what are some different causes, especially now that you've watched Three Identical Strangers. What could be some reasons that someone might develop a mental illness? And like I said, etiology just means the causes or the reasons for someone developing a mental illness. And these kind of correspond with the seven psychological perspectives. So even though abnormal or clinical psychology is no longer on the AP exam this year, I still think it's a really good review chapter for us because it kind of encompasses all the different perspectives. Because when we look at the etiology and the treatment of psychological illnesses, we look at the bio, psycho, and social causes of that, which encompass all the different perspectives. So it's a really good review going into the AP exam because, like we said, kind of each unit really contains a different perspective or has multiple perspectives in there. So good to know. So, what I'm going to do now is kind of break down the causes or etiology of a psychological disorder by these seven different psychological perspectives. And just to kind of make it a little bit easier, I'm going to use the example of an anxiety disorder to kind of explain all the causes of that. Because there's so many different disorders, it's a little easier to break it down into one specifically and focus on how the perspectives would explain the different causes for just one disorder. So let's get started. Kind of going in order from more nature to nurture. I'm going to take us. So in Three Identical Strangers, you saw a lot of this idea of, okay, what's more important, nature or nurture? And we see what unfortunately happens to Eddie. Is this more due to his genes, his nature, or to his upbringing and his family, adoptive family, his nurture? So, when explaining why, the reasons for why someone might develop a mental illness, the biological approach would focus on things with your genes and your brain. So, all the structures inside. So, they'd focus on things like brain part functioning, neurotransmitters, hormones. So, if you have an excess or deficiency in these things, your genes that you inherited from your family. So, some examples would be, say, depression results from a serotonin deficiency. So, you have the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors as a medication to fix that. And then we have anxiety disorders might result from low levels of inhibitory hormone GABA. So we'd see some kind of probably biomedical medication with that as well. And just a quick note that we see, yes, there's some biological causes, but we're really going to see that there's probably multiple different causes that result in someone developing a disorder. So it's good to look at it holistically. Okay, up next we have the evolutionary approach. And remember, this is all about our friend Charles Darwin. And he had that idea of natural selection, which is just saying that we want our genes and our offspring to reproduce and pass on for generation after generation after generation. So we want behaviors that are going to help ensure our survival so our genes are able to survive on to the next generation. So, what an evolutionary psychologist would say here is that anxiety was originally something that was positive. It was an adaptive response. So, if we think back to the caveman days, say that there's a wild boar or a venomous snake that is potentially going to injure you or kill you. Anxiety was there to help you because it would alert your sympathetic nervous system to get that fight or flight response going. And then that would allow for you to do what you need to do, fight, flight, run away, to ensure your survival. And it also would help alert you next time because you learn that, okay, snake not good, wild boar not good. Next time you see it, anxious heartbeat, and you'll know I'm in trouble, I'm going to run away. So anxiety was actually something that was really good, and it was naturally selected as an adaptive behavior to carry on in the gene pool and get passed down generation after generation until we have it nowadays. But the problem arises in that our environment right now is very different than the environment of our great 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 grandparents, the cavemen. Right now, while there was a lot of immediate threats to our health and well being, like a wild boar potentially attacking, um, our stressors now, like I mentioned before, I think in motivation, emotions, stress, our stressors right now are much more long term, like a stressful paper, a class, a relationship you're in. Uh, so you don't really need that immediate fight or flight response that our ancestors. So next we have the cognitive approach. And remember, anytime you see that word cognitive, you just think thinking. Cognitive has to do all about our thought processes, all the little workings of the gears inside your brain. So cognitive in this case would mainly talk about the different thought patterns you have and how dysfunctional or negative thought patterns could result in a psychological disorder. For example, with anxiety, depression, you see a lot of that negative self thought. And that is really detrimental and can help result or perpetuate and increase an existing psychological disorder. Another example would be something like OCD, where your obsessions are those thoughts that keep ruminating and interrupting your daily life. They're very dysfunctional and result in your compulsions, the behavior. So you see that mix between cognitive and behavior. So another example is connecting back to this term of internal versus external locus of control. We said that people that have an internal locus of control believe that their effort, that they can control their destiny, and that their effort and work that they're putting in results directly in the outcome that they're getting in their success or failure. So it's that mindset, that thought pattern mentality. But someone with an external locus of control doesn't see it that way. They see that they think that things are outside of their own control, that their successes or failures, there's not a whole lot that they personally can do about them because they think ultimately it's up to external things such as luck or fate. So these people, these are again a kind of thought pattern or way of thinking. So if you have an external locus of control, you might experience a lot of anxiety. If you think that things are outside of your control and that you have no control over things, that's really overwhelming and you might feel anxious. So this kind of negative thought pattern that people with external locus of controls have could potentially result in anxiety. And then my favorite perspective, the humanistic perspective, this is the rainbows and unicorns one. So remember, this is all about kind of fulfilling your needs and reaching your full potential. So the two important psychologists here, because I know I got a lot of comments talking about who do we need to know for the AP exam? So I'll try and emphasize them here. So humanistic approach, we have Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers is the guy who came up with this unconditional positive regard. So Carl Rogers says that if we don't get this unconditional positive regard, this could potentially result in a psychological disorder. An unconditional positive regard is just this unconditional support and respect, and in the case of like parents to children, love. So he says that parents should always be giving their children this. Children should know that they're going to be supported and respected and held in high regard no matter what. And same thing in his version of therapy. He believes that therapists should provide their clients with unconditional positive regard, that they should always be respecting them and kind of seeing them as equals no matter what the situation that their patient's going through. So that's Carl Rogers, and he says that if you don't have that, that could result in a psychological disorder. And next, we know Maslow at the back of our hand now. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Abraham Maslow. He says that we aren't able to reach this tip of the pyramid, self-actualization, if we don't have our lower needs met, such as love and belonging, safety, physiological kind of hunger, thirst, etc. So if we don't have these lower ones met, we won't be able to self-actualize and reach our full potentials. And he says that that could result in a psychological disorder if these needs aren't being met. Then next, we have the psychodynamic approach with our friend Sigmund Freud. We probably all know him very well by now. Weird dude. So we know that kind of those buzzwords or keywords when it comes to Freud and the psychodynamic approach is all about unconscious desires, repressed memories, or kind of dreams and urges and things like that. So people from the psychodynamic approach would say that kind of these unresolved, unconscious needs, desires, conflicts, and memories from our childhood that might be repressed and kind of thrown away so we can't consciously access them, those could be kind of arising and causing us problems and resulting in psychological disorders. Another example could be a fixation in an early psychosexual stage. Remember, we had oral, anal, things like that. Each stage, if you didn't pass through it successfully, could result in a fixation where you'd have some kind of issues related to that stage arising later in your adult life. So fixations could definitely result in kind of poor maladaptive behavior, dysfunctional behavior that would be characteristic of a psychological disorder. Then another reason could be, we said Freud has that iceberg analogy in the psychological selves of the id, ego, and superego. And just to review, remember we said the ego is kind of the mediator, that balance. I had the little devil and angel on the shoulder. Ego is the balance guy. He kind of mediates between the two of the id and ego, your angel and devil, id and superego. So we said id's the devil, superego's the hero that wants to do all the right thing, and the ego has to decide between them. And if the ego isn't successfully able to do that, then you're going to see psychological disorders arise because there's these conflicts that can't be properly resolved. So then now, like I said, this is all really good review, even though clinical psychology isn't on the AP exam. All these perspectives are getting tied together when we're looking at the causes of disorders. So it's very good review. So now we're going to look back to behaviorism. And this goes back to the learning unit. The behavioral approach would say that things like anxiety disorders are due to learned involuntary association through classical conditioning. Because remember, classical conditioning is behavior that's learned, but it's involuntary. You can't help it. It just happens. And they'd say that it's learned through classical conditioning and continued on through operant conditioning, which is getting rewarded or punished for that behavior. So a great example to kind of show how classical conditioning could result in anxiety or a phobia, a fear of something, is like we talked about with our little Albert study. So just a review of kind of the famous people in the behavioral perspective, specifically classical conditioning, would be Pavlov as the head honcho. He's the one that kind of discovered classical conditioning with his dog study. So the salivating dogs with the meat and the bell, etc. And then John Watson is the one who we're going to talk about here, who applied Pavlov's findings with classical conditioning to humans to see if humans can be classically conditioned to fear things. So this is where poor little baby Albert comes into play. Remember, little Albert, he's the one who is classically conditioned to fear all white furry things. So let's talk about how little Albert was, through the behavioral approach and classical conditioning specifically, was trained to fear and develop a phobia of white rats, and therefore all generalizing to all white furry things. So we said we had the unconditioned stimulus of the hammer, the scary sound resulting from the hammer. And then this results in the unconditioned response, which is Macaulay Culkin fear. Then we have, during conditioning, we have the neutral stimulus. So the little white rat alone doesn't cause anything. It's just a little Stuart Little, cute little guy. But then this becomes paired with our unconditioned stimulus of the hammer pounding, which is resulting in fear and being scared. So now you're going to pair this a bunch of times, and it's going to go Stuart Little, our little white rat, is going to go from being a neutral stimulus that didn't cause any kind of response to now alone without the unconditioned stimulus, becoming a conditioned stimulus, because conditioned means to learn. He becomes conditioned stimulus alone without anything else, causing the conditioned response of fear. So, like I said, classical conditioning, that's when it's kind of that involuntary learned response. You can't help it. If you, let's say again, little Albert, if he sees a little white rat, he's now going to have that involuntary response of his heart beating really fast, sweating, whatever. That's something that's involuntary and you can't help it. So it's classical conditioning that kind of creates our phobias or fears, but it's through operant conditioning, the one that's conscious, so a voluntary behavior, that is kind of continuing our fear. So, how might operant conditioning explain why a fear of rats obtained through classical conditioning persists? Let's break this down. So, now you have the stimulus, which is seeing a little white rat. And then this is going to result in the voluntary behavior, because key thing with operant conditioning is that it's voluntary. You are willingly doing it with your own knowledge. So then he's going to have the voluntary behavior of walking away. And then the consequence, so the operant consequence, which is either the reward or punishment or reinforcement, is going to be he's negatively reinforcing this behavior. So we see here that this is an example of negative reinforcement because he doesn't like rats. He wants to remove the unpleasant stimulus of a rat. So unpleasant stimulus is rat. Voluntary behavior is walking away, because walking away gets rid of the unpleasant stimulus of the rat. So through negative reinforcement, he is kind of reinforcing the behavior of walking away, because it's going to reduce or get rid of that negative stimulus of seeing the rat. And then this is going to promote and reinforce that future behavior of walking away to avoid rats. So every time he sees a rat, he's going to walk away because he was negatively reinforced to do that, so he no longer has to see the rats. So that's a good example of kind of operant conditioning at play here with rewards and punishments and reinforcements. All right. And then final perspective is our sociocultural perspective. So remember, this is all the way to the right on that nurture side. So it's saying that kind of all of our behavior is caused from what's going on in our environment and kind of the gender, ethnic, cultural, racial backgrounds and groups that we're from. So someone from the sociocultural perspective would say that anxiety disorders, while they might not fully be caused alone by social cultural things, so while an anxiety disorder might exist in any culture, it's that there's different sociocultural factors that might cause it to be more prevalent in one culture than another. So, for example, in the United States, we're very much an individualistic culture, and we work really, really hard and are super intense, and there's a lot of pressure that we face to kind of continue working, to be our best, to always be working, never let your guard down. You can't really relax. We always kind of score highest in countries that work the most and spend the most hours at work. So we kind of come from that culture of stress, and that might result in us having more anxiety than a different culture. For example, in Italy, what a life. Work ends. There's a really distinct, I noticed when I studied abroad there, distinct work-life balance. Work ends, you're going to go out in the street, have a drink with your friends, stand outside, walk around the neighborhood. There's very distinct balance between work and home social life. So there's kind of less pressure and anxiety than what people in the United States might face. And a really good example, talking about a psychological disorder of eating disorders, would be explained through social cultural lens. So this one study done by a psychologist of the name of Becker in 2002, this studies people from an island of Fiji who didn't have, it's a very remote island, and they didn't have television access until 1995. So they were very isolated from kind of Western cultural influences. And they kind of wanted to see if the introduction of media and Western influences and kind of the pressures that we see in the media to fit a certain image of what beauty is, to see if that's going to impact and result in changing rates of eating disorders. So they kind of checked in at 2 times. In 1995, right when television happened in their country, it went from 3% of people displaying anorexic or self reporting anorexic and bulimic behavior in 1995 to 15% in 1998. That's a huge jump in just a couple of years. So, kind of explaining that there's these sociocultural influences from our environment and norms from different groups that can influence developing a disorder. So while these disorders, again, exist across different cultures, it's those sociocultural factors and norms and pressures that might cause them to be more prevalent in one area than another, or one group than another. So that's how the different perspectives would explain the etiology or causes of different psychological disorders. So, what we're going to see though is that while they all have their pros and cons in how they are describing why a disorder might happen, it's really limiting to look at only one. For example, let's talk about three identical strangers and how monozygotic identical twins share the same genetic code. So while yes, it's good to know that, let's say, depression could result from a serotonin deficiency or that you have some kind of genetic imbalance or something like that that could result in depression. Why is it that Eddie, out of his triplets, was the one who, developed the most severe depression out of all of them? If they are all identical and sharing that same genetic code, wouldn't all of them develop it? So we're clearly limited by the biological approach if we're looking at that alone. We'd need to take into account the sociocultural approach of the environment that he's raised in, his family, his kind of overarching the norms of his family. So what we see here is kind of the solution of using the biopsychosocial approach. And we know this, we've been talking about this all year. It's just that combination of looking at the biological factors influencing someone's behavior, the cognitive factors, like your thought processes, and the sociocultural environmental factors. So this is important in looking at behavior holistically. So again, we're very limited if we're just looking at it through one perspective. It's best to look at it and attack it from multiple different angles and get that holistic view of why someone's behaving that way and why someone would be developing a mental disorder. So we have here the diathesis stress model. And this is kind of resulting from this biopsychosocial model of looking at the etiology and causes of a mental illness. So diathesis stress model says that developing a mental illness is a result of both nature and nurture. Like we see, this is a perfect example to use with the triplets. We can't just look solely at nature because that wouldn't make sense in explaining why one is getting the extreme severe depression and not the others if they're all sharing that same biological genetic code. So we need to look at nurture too. But again, we see that nurture isn't everything. They all battled some form of mental illness at some point in their life and had issues, even though someone like David had such a loving and caring family environment. So, neither one on their own can fully explain anything. You have to look at them as a combination. So, what this diathesis stress model does is look at both of these together. And they say that people have different genetic predispositions for getting a mental illness. So, essentially, that at birth, some people, just due to their genetic code, are going to have a predisposition or be more likely to develop a mental illness based on their genes. So, for example, we see here in black, this is looking at your genetic predisposition to develop a psychological disorder at some point in your life. So just based on your genes. And then this dotted line is what they say is a hypothetical threshold for developing a disorder. So if you pass this line, then you hypothetically would kind of have enough kind of issues going on to result in developing a psychological disorder. But if you're under this hypothetical threshold line, then you will not ultimately develop a psychological disorder. So we see here that none of them yet have, just alone with their predisposition, fully met the criteria to pass this threshold and develop a mental illness. But some are more likely. So look, this could be person 2 is much more likely than person 1 to develop a mental illness. Person 1 has a lower genetic predisposition than person 2. So then we're going to look at the environmental and nurture component of it now. So this light gray now takes into account the environmental stress that a person is experiencing in their lifetime. So some people, we're going to see, might experience much more environmental stress than others. So we see here that like person 1 and 2, they're experiencing a lot more environmental stress than, say, person 3 and 4. So if we take this, we need to take into account, again, the nature and nurture and seeing if someone's going to develop a mental illness. So person 1, they had a lower predisposition and had more environmental stress than most, but because they had that lower genetic predisposition, they still don't meet that threshold for developing a mental illness. But person 2 had a higher threshold and encountered a decent amount of environmental stress in their lifetime. So maybe they experienced some kind of trauma or went through hardship and issues. And it looks like they, through the combined genetic predisposition and what they encountered in their nurture, their environment, do ultimately pass this threshold and would hypothetically develop a mental illness. Same thing with person 3. They had enough environmental stress to cause this. But even though person 4 had the same genetic predisposition as person 3, person 4 didn't encounter as much environmental stress in their lifetime and therefore didn't end up passing this threshold and hypothetically won't develop a disorder. So diathesis stress model, big thing, it's looking at the nature and nurture and kind of combining this whole biopsychosocial model of these different perspectives in explaining mental illness. So now let's apply this to 3 identical strangers. And this is why I wanted to show us this movie so badly during this unit, because it does such an excellent job of showing this diathesis stress model and nature and nurture at play. So here again, monozygotic twins share the same DNA and would have essentially the same genetic predisposition at birth, right, to develop a mental disorder. So let's take the twins, their genetic, or triplets, their genetic predisposition is all the same. But we're going to see, so this is the nature, and then now we're going to see the nurture at play. the environmental stress, whether that's trauma, hardship, and things that they're enduring throughout their life. David had a really, really positive home environment with his dad, Bubba, and he, and this isn't fully accurate, I want to say, because they did encounter some kind of mental illness at some point in their life. So I'm not fully accurate here because they would meet this, but Eddie was the one who had the most severe, obviously. So I'm just kind of showing that here. But David encountered the least, so he would have a lower bar for the environmental stress. Same thing with Robert, a little bit higher, but lower. But Eddie, he didn't have that good relationship with his dad, had maybe a little bit more of a tough childhood and things like that. And maybe his thinking, he had more negative thoughts and stuff than the others. So Eddie would have this highest level of environmental stress, and then this would put him over that threshold to develop a mental illness. And this shows the importance of nature and that they all had this predisposition, and that they were pretty likely a high disposition to develop a mental illness at some point in their life, but they're not there yet. It shows the importance of environmental stress as well. So clearly, if you have more environmental stress, this can be that tipping point that's going to cause you to ultimately develop a psychological disorder. So we see nature and nurture is very important in explaining why some people develop a psychological disorder and some people don't. All right, so now we're going to wrap up by just talking a little bit about psychological treatments. And we're also going to look at these through the biopsychosocial lens. And I want to focus on kind of combating misconceptions about treatments. So we see here, first misconception, this is very much that Freudian talk about your repressed memories and dreams and desires type thing. We see that sitting on a couch with the male psychiatrist taking notes. Well, sometimes that might happen. This is definitely not what most psychological treatment looks like nowadays. So we're going to talk about combating those misconceptions. So I love this video from SNL. I want you guys to take a sec, pause the video, go on Google Slides, watch this, and kind of talk about what misconceptions and stereotypes you see about treatment and therapy that they're bringing up. So the main misconception I really want to combat when it comes to therapy is, especially what we saw in the SNL video, is that therapy isn't going to fix everything after just one session. You see in the Friendos video, they said, breakthrough. You're not going to have that magical breakthrough after just one session, typically. I was just watching an episode of Criminal Minds this weekend where this guy, he's a psychologist, and he lures people in to kill them by saying, I'll cure your anxiety in 2 sessions. Come here. But I would say, no. This guy isn't real, because real psychologists know that it doesn't just happen overnight. And then second thing, again, therapy, while talk therapy is one form of therapy, there's many, many, many different forms of therapy, including behavioral therapies. That wouldn't be just that traditional talking back and forth between a psychologist and their patient. So lots of different therapies. Talk therapy is just one of the many tools that psychologists have in their treatment tool belt. So I'm going to break these down real quick by the biopsychosocial, and within that, the specific kind of perspectives that they cover of different treatments. So biomedical therapies, that would include drug medications like anti-anxiety meds, antidepressants, psychotics. Psychosurgery, we see that this is kind of a last resort thing though. Now that we have better medical and therapeutic treatments, we don't like to cut into people if we don't have to. Electroconvulsive therapy, which is like shock therapy. And then under psycho, we have psychodynamics, so kind of that Freudian, talk about repressed memories. Humanistic is that client-centered with Mr. Carl Rogers, where the client kind of leads it, and you have that unconditional positive regard and respect and understanding between the patient and the client. And then cognitive would be cognitive restructuring, in which you're trying to, remember cognitive thinking, you're trying to change those self-deprecating, self-destructive kind of thoughts that are negative. You're trying to restructure your thoughts and make them positive instead of those negative thoughts that are ruminating in your mind and making things worse. And then social would go under that behavioral category mainly. So a really good example of this would be counter conditioning. So we saw with little Albert, we were able to condition him to fear all white furry things and develop that phobia. With classical conditioning, we can now use classical conditioning to counter condition and get rid of that phobia. So here you're going to pair together a positive thing with that negative conditioned stimulus. So I'm going to take the unconditioned stimulus of Ben and Jerry's, and this is going to elicit a positive feeling or a sense of relaxation in me because I love that flavor. Then I'm going to now pair this, again, unconditioned stimulus of Ben and Jerry's ice cream with the conditioned stimulus of the rat that I've been conditioned to be afraid of. And now this is going to result in that unconditioned response of positivity and feeling at ease because the ice cream's there. So now after you pair that all together a bunch of times, what's going to happen? You're going to no longer associate the rat with something scary and have a fear response, but now it's going to cause you to have that sense of relaxation and positivity because you paired it together with that positive thing so much. So that's counter conditioning. Another thing would be aversion conditioning, in which, say you have a behavior like picking at your hair, your nails, or smoking that you don't want to do anymore. You're going to pair that with something unpleasant. So example, if you're smoking, maybe you'd put something that tastes really bad on your cigarette. So then every time you smoke it, you're going to have that aversion to it, and then that's going to kind of be conditioned into no longer liking to smoke. Virtual reality exposure therapy is another really good one, and I have a video on there. So kind of if you have a phobia, it's kind of immersing you in your fear. This is used with PTSD a lot to kind of simulate combat and work through your fears together. And then modeling therapy, think Bandura, Bobo, Bash and Bobo. He did that socio-cognitive theory or the where he talks about modeling and that kind of a thing. So modeling would be looking at someone who has their life together and is a positive role model, and then looking at their behavior and trying to model that because it's observational learning. All right, so that's mainly it. Have a great day, you guys. Just make sure you're working on your Unit 4 summative of that video project and analyzing. Hopefully, all this stuff is helpful in understanding the etiologies and treatments when you're analyzing that from the biopsychosocial perspective. Have a fabulous day, you guys.